The fields of the South at dawn carry a silence heavier than the morning mist. Each row of cotton, each broken fence post, is a witness to centuries of hidden torment. The echoes of chains may have faded, but the traces of exploitation remain written in bloodlines, in stories whispered from generation to generation, in the soil itself. Within the walls of the big house, white masters exercised a power so absolute it extended beyond ownership of labor into the most intimate recesses of human life. Enslaved women lived under constant surveillance, their bodies a currency of wealth, their choices non-existent. The veneer of gentility, the polished floors, the chandeliers, they masked the darkness that cannot be washed away. Obedience was survival, submission was safety, and the cost was often unspeakable suffering. Every favor bestowed, every private instruction given, was infused with coercion. Every glance or touch from a master carried the weight of violence. Women bore children not of love but of ownership. Their wombs a vessel of both life and oppression, their lives tangled in a web of fear, shame, and survival instinct. The big house became a theater of hidden horrors. Behind closed doors, the rules of the plantation were rewritten to benefit the powerful. Diaries, letters, and WPA narratives reveal how these crimes were both systematic and concealed, how language was twisted, favorite, house servant, companion to obscure brutality beneath civility. White mistresses, themselves confined by the strictures of patriarchy, often became enforcers of this abuse, punishing enslaved women who were perceived as rivals, asserting control with a cruelty that left emotional and physical scars. Pregnancy, separation, forced labor, and humiliation became tools to maintain dominance. These acts were invisible to society at large, buried beneath layers of etiquette, legal loopholes, and social expectation. Yet the human cost was profound: shattered families, psychological trauma, stolen autonomy, and generational suffering that carried forward long after the chains were broken. Modern historians and geneticists piece together fragments of this hidden history. DNA studies confirm what archival research suggested. The children of white masters with enslaved women were widespread, a silent testament to the sexual exploitation that textbooks once ignored. Genealogical records, letters, and oral histories reveal patterns of abuse, survival strategies, and resistance. Women hid, fled, or submitted, navigating the impossible choice between death, punishment, and continued survival. These stories, once silenced, now confront us with a truth too long denied: that sexual violence was a systemic instrument of power, not a series of isolated incidents. Each revelation challenges the myths of the Old South, demanding recognition of a reality that is messy, painful, and inescapably human. Post-slavery narratives sought to erase this history, sanitizing the past with images of loyal slaves and benevolent masters. Early Hollywood, Southern literature, and school textbooks perpetuated these myths, offering a fantasy that obscured trauma, silenced voices, and shielded the oppressors from accountability. Yet, through scholarly work and the courage of descendants reclaiming their stories, the hidden abuses are now coming to light. The plantation's legacy is no longer a tale of gentility, but a testament to survival, resistance, and the endurance of human dignity in the face of relentless oppression. Each uncovered story, each name recovered, disrupts the long-standing silence and restores humanity to those who were denied it. Psychologically, these crimes reveal a system in which power, obsession, and legality merged into sanctioned abuse. White male entitlement and the institutionalized subjugation of black women created a hierarchy in which desire was conflated with domination, and ownership over land became ownership over flesh. Even as enslaved women resisted, hid, or attempted to reclaim autonomy, they faced a relentless apparatus that reinforced compliance through fear, violence, and economic incentive. The acts themselves, though horrific, were compounded by the cultural and legal structures that rendered them invisible, normalized, and untouchable. It was not mere lust, it was systemic corruption, a moral and ethical rot embedded in law and tradition. Resistance was fraught, survival was complicated, and the consequences reverberated across generations. Today, walking through the remnants of these plantations, one sees the elegance and the terror coexisting. Sunlight spilling across manicured lawns while shadows cling to the corners, echoing the voices of the enslaved. Descendants trace their ancestors' lives through archival documents, oral histories, and the landscape itself, confronting both personal and collective trauma. The fields, the hallways, the broken furniture, they bear witness to the suffering, resilience, and courage of those who endured. Each recovered story, each act of remembrance, transforms the silence into a chorus of recognition and understanding. The hidden horrors of sexual exploitation, once masked by power and privilege, are now named, documented, and remembered. By acknowledging this history, we confront the uncomfortable truth that slavery was not only a system of labor and economic exploitation but a regime of sexual control and psychological terror. The enslaved women whose lives were stolen, violated, and controlled left a legacy that persists in memory, culture, and DNA. Their stories remind us that survival is complex, courage is measured in endurance, and justice begins with truth. The soil of the South, once the stage for silence and domination, now becomes a repository of memory and resilience, holding the testimonies of those who lived, resisted, and survived. Their voices, once buried, now demand to be heard, and in listening, we begin to reckon with the full, haunting scope of history. The darkness that hung over the plantation was not only in the night but in the very structure of society. Every brick, every polished floorboard of the big house concealed whispers of abuse and terror. Enslaved women moved through these spaces like shadows themselves, forced to navigate a labyrinth of power, privilege, and violence. They were invisible yet hyper-visible, required to serve, to obey, to smile under the gaze of masters and mistresses who saw them as less than human yet essential to the household's order. Each step, each gesture was measured against the potential for punishment. Each look, each word, a silent negotiation with power that could take life, liberty, or family in an instant. Survival demanded submission, yet submission did not grant safety, and defiance was met with the most intimate forms of terror, the control of bodies, of desires, of futures. The plantation was a theater where public appearances masked private atrocities, and every act of cruelty was justified under law, tradition, or the warped moral reasoning of those who claimed dominion. Within the walls of the master's house, the abuse was methodical and deliberate. Rooms that gleamed with wealth and elegance became stages for exploitation, where enslaved women were summoned under the guise of household duties and coerced into acts that violated the most sacred boundaries of their personhood. The tools of oppression were subtle and overt alike. A threatening glance, the promise of favor, the fear of sale or beatings, and the omnipresent knowledge that resistance could cost a family member their life. White mistresses, bound by their own societal restrictions yet wielding authority over the enslaved, often enacted cruelty driven by jealousy, fear, or the desire to maintain hierarchy. Punishments could be public or private, physical or emotional, but the scars, both visible and invisible, endured long after the act itself. Every forced pregnancy, every stolen moment of autonomy, every shattered relationship between mother and child became a mark on the collective soul of the enslaved community, embedding trauma that would echo for generations. Historical evidence, pieced together through diaries, letters, oral testimonies, and WPA narratives, reveals the scale and intimacy of this hidden exploitation. Harriet Jacobs' memoir stands as a chilling testimony, a voice that survived centuries of suppression to expose the relentless sexual violence enslaved women endured. Her story, far from unique, illuminates a system where power corrupted absolutely, turning homes into cages and relationships into instruments of domination. Modern historians have traced these legacies, connecting bloodlines and reconstructing family histories that bear the unmistakable imprint of abuse. DNA studies reveal the inheritance of these hidden crimes, a silent chronicle of systemic exploitation encoded into generations, a grim testament to the intersection of race, gender, and power in the plantation hierarchy. The psychological burden imposed upon these women was profound. They were required to navigate constant threats, social manipulation, and intimate violations while maintaining the outward appearance of compliance. Shame, fear, and a fractured sense of self became weapons wielded by the enslavers as surely as chains or whips. Children born of abuse became living reminders of domination, their existence entwined with trauma and survival. Religion, law, and social convention conspired to erase these experiences, framing obedience as virtue and punishment as divine will. Even when slavery ended, the narratives of these women were suppressed, ignored, or sanitized, leaving descendants with inherited trauma, silent stories, and a need to reclaim history from the margins. The erasure of these truths allowed myths to flourish. Images of the happy slave, the benevolent master, and the benevolent Gentle mistress permeated literature, film, and education. Romanticized plantations masked the terror within, offering a false nostalgia that obscured the suffering, the manipulation, and the sexual violence that underpinned wealth and social status. Today, scholars, filmmakers, and descendants work to dismantle these myths, uncovering documents, personal testimonies, and archival evidence to restore the dignity of those whose lives were stolen. Every recovered story, every acknowledgement of abuse, acts as a form of historical resistance, an attempt to name what was long unnamed, to give voice to the silenced, and to confront the moral and psychological wreckage left in the wake of systemic sexual exploitation. Understanding the mechanisms of control reveals a society where power and ownership were absolute, and morality was applied selectively. Enslaved women endured daily infringements upon their humanity, the seizure of their labor, their time, their reproductive rights, and their personal dignity. The legal and social framework of the plantation not only permitted but incentivized these violations. The white master's control over the body became a tool of economic and social power, while the white mistress's enforcement of hierarchy imposed additional layers of psychological violence. Resistance required cunning, courage, and endurance, yet even survival was a continuous negotiation with terror. The plantation system, while collapsing physically with emancipation, left a legacy of trauma encoded in families, communities, and collective memory. Today, walking the ruins of these plantations, the weight of history is tangible. The fields, the big houses, and the overgrown quarters bear witness to suffering once hidden behind wealth and etiquette. Descendants walk through these spaces, reading names carved into wood, piecing together lives erased by cruelty, and reclaiming narratives long suppressed. The silence of centuries is pierced by scholarship, storytelling, and remembrance. In naming the abuses, documenting the evidence, and acknowledging the survivors, we confront not only the horrors of the past, but also the endurance of the human spirit. The ghosts of these plantations are no longer silent. They speak through research, through memory, and through the courage of those who refuse to let the stories fade again. This history, harrowing and complex, teaches that power without accountability corrupts utterly, that ownership of people becomes ownership of their very being, and that survival often demands endurance under conditions no human should endure. The legacies of these hidden sexual crimes remain, shaping identity, family, and culture long after the chains have been broken. By acknowledging this past, we honor the resilience of the enslaved, the courage of those who bore witness, and the unyielding necessity of truth. The plantation soil, soaked with the pain, resistance, and survival of generations, holds stories that are finally being heard, remembered, and reckoned with.